All right, hi guys. Welcome to week one, or week two, I should say, but week one of the main content. Start again in 3, 2, 1. Hi guys, welcome to week one. In this week, we're going to cover strength training for sports performance. So what we're going to cover today is I'm going to go over our learning approach again. So we're going to tick off the principles first, which sort of govern our strength training, and the research that validates that. We're going to go into our methods, and then finally the systems, and in particular the systems we use. So for the principles, we're going to tick over morphological and neurological adaptations and how they occur. We're going to look at different ways we use research to validate that. We're going to, as I said, go over the methods that we use and other common ones you'll come across, and then I'll sort of finish it up by funneling how we put that down to the athletes that we work with. So first, I just want to create some context around strength training, where it's come from and where we're going with it, and how it sort of taught us lessons over different eras. So if you notice on the left of screen, back in the 5th century BC, the famous myth of Milo of Croton, and this was really our first sort of storytelling or understanding of the effects of external resistance-based training and the law of progressive overload. So basically Milo carried the cow every single day, and the cow continues to grow, and the weight of the cow acted as a form of resistance, increasing sort of his physical development during that time. It's a really cool way to sort of understand the story and apply that to strength. In the 2nd century, you can see the image there was actually the first sort of discovery of dumbbells, and they're actually referred to as halters at the time. It was the first time that an external object or weight was designed to have a training effect. They used to use them and throw them and see how far they could throw them, and they sort of measured their strength or their value in their society or community at the time based off those measures. In 1896, at the first Olympics, weightlifting was included. Obviously, what we know as Olympic weightlifting. And these were sort of conducted as basically the challenge was to lift an external load from the ground and place it overhead. So much different to the technique we see these days, but a genuine measure of sort of weightlifting as a sport, and also the physical feat that it had on the human body. More recently, in the 1950s, was the introduction of powerlifting, or the popularization of competitive powerlifting, which we know as our squat, bench, and deadlift. It actually started off as a squat, deadlift, and barbell curl. Once they sort of realized that the curl had a diminishing return, it quickly became the bench press. And that really underpins a lot of our principles around strength training and concepts in terms of how do we get neurological load that matches a quality we can use in sports performance. In the 80s, we see the popularization of bodybuilding. Obviously, guys like Arnold Schwarzenegger, Ronnie Coleman and stuff really put that in the mainstream and really sort of highlighted to the public and the sporting world that potentially there is some benefit increasing muscular size. To what extent that continues to, we've sort of probably found the capacity, and we'll talk about that in the adaptation phase. And then more recently now, it's the advancements of technological assistance. So you can see on the right-hand image, the use of linear transducers, which are essentially measuring bar speed, which allow us to get more feedback rather than just weight on how the athlete's moving and what strength adaptations they're actually training. So I'm going to dive into principles now. The first principles I want to talk about are essentially adaptations. What's happening to the body on a physiological level. So we're going to tick off what is general adaptations, what is the concept of that, and then we're going to go into morphological and neurological adaptations. So the general adaptation syndrome, or GAS, was first conceptualized in 1936 by a scientist called Hans Selye, and he performed studies on rats, and he basically put them in different stress environments to work out how they respond to that. We use this model now as a specific response to understand if stress is physical or emotional and how that's applied. Hans' research gave us a 3-phase approach to this. So he broke stress down to 3 phases. And the first one is the alarm phase, and that's where the stress is being applied. The second phase is the resistance phase, and that's where the body is adapting or going through the adapting process to that stress. And then the third one is exhaustion phase, and that exhaustion phase generally occurs when the stress has been too great and the body or the emotional state needs rest from that. We use this model as a potential model to explain the adaptive responses in training environments. And when I jump to the next slide, you'll see a slight variation in this model to Hans' original one. Essentially what it implies is that adaptation is dose dependent. So too much adaptation, the results can be deadly, and too little, nothing will occur. So what it's teaching us is that we need to find a dose dependent approach that is great enough to create a stress response without creating exhaustion in the body. What we can see in this model here is that just like Hans' model, we still have our alarm resistance and overtraining or exhaustion phase, but we also have the supercompensation phase, and that's really what we're trying to empower our athletes with or expose them to, is that supercompensation phase. So as I was touching on, the alarm phase is the stress applied. So in our case, in the gym setting, it's the resistance training task. The resistance phase is the body going to adapting to that and the recovery process. Once that recovery process has taken place, we jump up into a supercompensation phase where we now have essentially a new ability or a great adaptation to perform that task. And we can see that with phase 3 sitting in increased performance level. And then what you can see there is if we don't get that resistance phase right, if we don't have enough rest, we won't achieve supercompensation and we'll trickle down to an overtraining phase where you can see is in phase 4. And essentially that is an exhaustion phase where we're not eliciting enough recovery time or we're overperforming the stimulus to get an effective response from that. And that's essentially why we have to be so careful with either deload weeks or load stimulus or load dosage. So firstly, let's go into morphological strength adaptations. So essentially with morphological adaptations, we're looking to increase the cross-sectional area, and specifically the enlargement of tissues, a positive change in fiber type, increased density of myofilaments, and an increased structural change to connective tissues and tendons. So we're trying to change the physical structure of the human body. Now, as a result of changing this physical structure, we're providing the muscle function with a greater capacity to work with. And so when you're working with people who have a low capacity in the first place, increasing these qualities, increasing these morphological adaptations are basically giving them a greater pool of muscle to work with, which is going to help with all elements of different muscle functions and performance. Essentially, these take 6 weeks to occur at least of consistent progressive resistance training and stress overload. And these will all be influenced by training, gender, age, and frequency. And generally with people, we want to increase the morphological stress first. And the reason for that is that we're increasing that muscle tissue to then make the neurological adaptations to that muscle tissue afterwards. So morphological stress is generally seen in that first 12 months of development where we're trying to create structural change to the human body. It also has a really good benefit just from a robustness perspective, especially in contact sports, in a protective mechanism from other structures of the body, such as the bones and joints. Moving on to neurological strength adaptations. So with neurological adaptations, essentially it's anything that refers to the brain and its function. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to improve the coordination and the recruitment so we can empower or improve the execution of strength-based training or resistance-based training. We're trying to make things more efficient in a sense. There are three main neurological physiological elements to this. And that's the Golgi tendons, which are responsible for the sensory feedback under stretch or shortening. So whenever we're doing an exercise, it's what sort of gives our body feedback on how to make things work. The Renshaw cells act to prevent the body from essentially doing too much. So their main role is to prevent muscular damage, and they're basically made up of neurons found in the spinal cord. And as I said, they're responsible for creating signals to prevent the body doing too much. Supraspinal signals, our last one, is essentially our conscious and unconscious signaling system from the brain. And this is what provides our body with movement, our unconscious movement, which happens autonomously, and our conscious movement, which we decide to instill, are all driven by our supraspinal inhibitory signals. And there are three main physiological elements that dictate neurological components. The next thing I want to touch on, neurological adaptations, and probably the more important stuff as we move away from the basic science and anatomy, is the two concepts that we can address, and that is intramuscular coordination and intermuscular coordination. Specifically, intramuscular coordination refers to synchronization, recruitment, and rate coding. And so this is sort of the under the skin stuff that we don't see much byproduct of, but essentially what it refers to is the ability to control the control of motor units, the capacity to recruit motor units, so how many motor units can we recruit for this task, and the rate at which we can fire these motor units as. So when we get into sort of high-end training, these are the things that we're trying to improve the performance of speed, power, quickness. All these elements go into changing the muscular makeup beyond a tissue capacity and beyond a coordination capacity. So it's really the sort of high-end 5% stuff where we can really see greater improvement. Intermuscular coordination essentially refers to the coordination of the kinetic chain and how we can make movements more efficient. Now, this is skill-based. What that means is that we can address this in the first 6 weeks of training, and that's generally what's going to allow morphological stress to be easier to execute, and then down the track allowing us to change intramuscular stress in different ways. Now, having said that, doesn't mean that we don't get intramuscular adaptation earlier, but essentially intermuscular coordination is the first piece of the puzzle. We need to address skill-based training, the coordination of movements, the ability to execute proper motor control of certain exercises to then allow us to load those exercises, which comes down morphological stress. Once we're getting good structural load into the body, we can then start getting a little bit creative in terms of how we're addressing the intramuscular coordination elements, which are again is our increase in firing, our capacity to recruit as much as possible, and that's sort of our third level. So the way I look at it is that we have our intermuscular coordination, which we're trying to get skill development into first. We then create morphological stress through the body, and then once we have those qualities, we are developing intramuscular coordination. Once we have really branched out and focused on each element, we then want to make sure we're consistently filling up the cups of each quality, and we are not neglecting any quality. So once we have basic motor skill function, we need to increase the complexity of movements. Once we have morphological stress developed and we have increased cross-sectional area or muscle tissue, we need to maintain that. Once we're starting to increase intramuscular coordination, we need to keep that excitation there. We need to keep them exposed to high neural stresses. So it's really important that we have to develop the quality of each, but then we have to maintain the quality throughout our training periods. So this next slide really simply gives us a bit of a breakdown on an intensity chart in terms of what we're addressing. So what we can see is we're probably better off looking at the percentage chart as opposed to the rep, sort of the relative 1RM rep. But if you notice in the 40 to 60% chart, even up to 70%, intermuscular coordination, so that skill-based training is getting a really solid effect. And we are still getting some intramuscular qualities, but not as much. Whereas as soon as we jump to a 3RM or an 80% plus, so 80 to 100%, all of a sudden our intramuscular coordination is starting to increase a lot. Same thing with the hypertrophy, is that 60 to 80% is really appropriate for creating specific hypertrophy, which tells us that's probably the intensity we want to be working at with relative loads to create that muscular stress. So this is a really nice table to understand what intensities we should be working at to get specific muscular adaptations. And we can use this tool in all sorts of ways, but it acts as a really good resource in that regard. Next thing I want to go over is strength training mechanics and more specifically levers, and looking at the body in a leverage system. So we're going to go over the physics of levers, talk about the 3 types of levers, and then some practical considerations with training. So essentially, in the simplest form, our joints and limbs create a mechanical leverage system that allows us to move in certain ways. Without this leverage system, we'd just be a blob or a stick or a straight object. If we understand this system, we understand human movement and then how we can enhance human movement from that. So when we break down the 3 leverage approaches, we can understand how we can enhance performance using those levers to our advantage. Essentially, levers have the potential to do 2 things. They have the ability to act on a force via rotation around a fulcrum or a pivot point, which in our case is our joints. It also has the ability to create force or resist forces acting upon it. So this is our isometric contractions, where we're absorbing force. It might be landing from a jump, or it might be, in another case, perhaps a rugby scrum or something of the like. Breaking down the levers, so there are 4 key components, and I'm going to put this in sort of a human anatomy phase so we can understand what it's relating to. So the fulcrum is the joint. You can see the yellow part of the image there, and that's where the movement will act upon. The moment arm, which is our limbs, which is in this case the blue part of the seesaw. Force or muscular force, force which is generated through our muscles, which in this case is the green arrow pushing down. That will be our muscle working on the moment arm. And then the fourth one is the resistive force. So that's the external load placed upon the lever system. Our first class lever is a lever for which the muscle force and the resistive force act on opposite sides of the fulcrum. This is our classic lever system, the one we see probably most commonly and understand the earliest, and that's our seesaw system, where we have even loads on either side. Force is acted on one side and it moves the load on the other side. Now, a classic example of this in the human body would be the neck, where we can tilt forward or back. If we're moving back, then we're using our extensors on the back of the neck and the front of the head becomes the load, and vice versa. Our second class lever is a lever for which the muscle force and resistive force acts on the same side of the fulcrum. The muscular moment arm is longer than the resistive moment arm. This is our lever we use, or is designed when we're trying to move heavier loads. So a classic example of this would be the wheelbarrow, where you have the big tub, which you can fill up, and you have the small fulcrum at the front where the wheel is, which allows us to pick up and move heavy objects. Same thing works with the ankle joint. A classic example of this is the calf raise. You take anyone that hasn't lifted in the gym before, you try them to move 50 kilos. The only one they're probably going to do it on in day one is probably going to be something as simple as the calf raise. So it's a really good advantageous movement for trying to move heavy loads. Our third class lever is a lever for which the muscle force and resistive force act on the same side of the fulcrum, with the muscle force acting through a moment arm shorter than the resistive moment arm. So these are a really common lever. An example of this would be elbow flexion. Practical example of that would be hammering a nail. Could also be a bicep curl. So considerations we want to make looking at lever systems is understand what type of lever is being used during movement. So whilst we don't need to look at everything in a mechanic sense, if we can understand what levers are being applied in what exercises, and sometimes there are multiple levers being used, then we can understand if it's going to be a high demand exercise or a low demand exercise for the athlete. The heavier the load, the more efficient the type of lever needs to be. So if we're trying to get really heavy loads for different training variations, we need to understand we need to be on the side of more mechanically advantageous lever systems. Levers are dictated by limb length and joint structures. So we need to select loads accordingly. People with longer limb lengths, their levers are going to be more exaggerated than others with shorter lever lengths. Classic example of that, you see a short, stocky guy in the gym. He's got much more efficient levers than the longer, tall, skinny guy. We just need to factor those things in when we're trying to load. The more efficient the lever, the less stress on the structure. So if we can set a lever up to be more efficient movement-wise, it's probably more beneficial for someone who's starting off or who has a low strength tolerance to work with, so we can ensure that we're not getting too much stress through their structural system whilst also getting load using their lever system. We can adjust the lever complexity to be used to adjust the desired training adaptation. What I mean by that is that if we change an exercise, say from the front squat to the back squat, increasing the leverage advantage allows us to increase the load. From changing that without changing the reps, sets, time, anything like that, I can create a positive training stimulus by increasing load, increasing the stress on the body without making any other change. So we can use levers as an effective way to create progressive overload. Again, not the be all and end all, but what I want you to take away from this is that levers are a really helpful way to look at movement and understand the complexity of movement and where progressions and regressions of exercises can take place. So moving on to the research. Now there's three things I want to look at the research today. I'm going to use three different examples. Strength training, in a sense, from our research pool is endless. So you can research this until the cows come home. But what's the key thing to look at is how can we use strength training research to help validate what we're trying to do. So the first thing I want to look at is this study from Warren Young, not so much a study, sorry, actually a review of strength and power training in sports performance. And so what this review tells us is some really key findings and summaries of strength training research that's taken place, which shows transference from general resistance training to performance. And that's highlighted in this example here, where we can see that in baseball throwing group, those that undertook an 8-week bench press and pullover exercise program had nearly a 23% increase in their 6RM strength, which was accompanied by a 4.1% or a significant increase in their baseball throwing velocity. So essentially what happened is you got a group of guys doing a general upper body resistance program. They note an increase in strength, and as an increase in strength, they also get a positive increase in their throwing velocity, which is a direct performance output. Further down to this, we also notice the benefits of using general strength training as a more effective method to basic balance training and proprioceptive feedback. So increasing their muscular performance has also increased their ability to apply that to things outside of what we see as strength, which in this case is balance, proprioception, and awareness. So we can put that down to some of those neurological adaptations into muscular sense. And so this approach of using reviews allows us to validate the worthiness and the purpose of using strength training with sports. The next one I want to look at is this study by Hoff, a Scandinavian group, which basically looked at, does strength training improve aerobic performance? And so it was a pretty simple study, and there's heaps of these ones done. And they used specific strength training in this case. So they used resisted ski slopes. So they were cross-country skiers, and they were using resisted ski ergs with this and different cable weights. Essentially what we can see if we look at the strength results, if we look at the HRT group, the high resistance training group, and compare that to the control group, is both groups were fairly similar prior, but post-test there is a significant increase for the resistance training group compared to the control group. And if you jump over to the peak force outputs, there's a significant difference for each group, for the high resistance training group in each quality in producing peak force compared to those that weren't. So what we can take is, okay, so the HRT group has increased their strength, they've increased their maximal strength, they've increased their force output. How has that affected their aerobic qualities? What we can see in the VO2 peak area is they have a slight increase from their pre-test to post-test results for their VO2. It's not hugely significant, but it is bigger than the control group. But what's more noticeable is the time to exhaustion, where we can see that they've gone from 6.49 minutes to 10.18 minutes compared to the control group, which is 7.45 minutes, which only went to 9.31 minutes. So again, a significant improvement. So it's a classic example of being able to see, okay, here's a group, they've done some strength training, here's a group they haven't. Has it improved performance? And in this case, really evident, really clear. So it's a really cool way to see that increasing strength increases aerobic performance. And the main mechanism for that is efficiency. So basically, their muscle tissue has the ability to work more efficiently. It fatigues less quickly. It uses less oxygen. The last one is a simple study that Dan Baker used, a more a review on terms of using strength training to improve vertical jump performance. And the reason I put this in there is this is a classic way we can use research to give us methods and training methods and practical applications. So what this shows us is a general to specific approach to jumps training. And what's really important here is understanding where someone is on this continuum. So if someone's just starting off, doing general squats is going to have a positive improvement on their jumps performance. But if they have already general strength, they're going to need more training adaptation. So then you move into special jump squats, which is the transition from those general squats into more of explosive jump squat, and then looking at more specific loaded jumps to the task. So as they develop more specifically or more progressively or more advanced, I should say, the demand or the training stimulus needs to become more specific. So what we want to think of is if we want to improve someone's jump performance and they've never done anything before, jumping to a specific loaded jump is probably going to be a bit more advanced and it's not going to be the necessary stimulus we need, whereas doing a bunch of general squats at the start is going to be fine. And so having an example like this gives us a basic progression list straight away. It gives us something we can build and implement into our program, whilst also providing evidence that it works. And so there's sort of 3 different ways we can use research to conduct how we want to set up our training programs and systems and essentially validate what we're trying to do. All right, let's jump into methods and let's be honest, it's probably more of the interesting stuff. So quickly going to branch off the 3 general methods of strength training. And the reason I've highlighted these 3 is that if you look at any movement in the gym, it's going to fall into one of these 3 categories. So going to powerlifting first, essentially it's an effective way for increasing relative strength levels in bilateral patterns. It mainly develops neurological adaptations. That's not to say that you can't get morphological stress, but generally the way the programming is set up and the execution of it is it's neurologically driven. It does lack specificity sports and versatility in training exposure. So predominantly the task is to complete 3 main lifts, a squat, bench and deadlift, all bilateral. So we're narrowing our training exposure. And the reason why this sort of has a diminishing return to athletes is that yes, we're going to get awesome bilateral strength development and relative strength levels. We can use it to get really high neurological stress, but our versatility and training exposure for the demands of randomized activity that happens in sports is really little. So it's a tool, definitely. It's got great use and we use elements of it, but powerlifting as a whole for sports performance won't provide enough long-term. Bodybuilding, a super effective way for increasing morphological strength adaptations and foundational strength qualities or structural strength qualities. It does lack attention on motor development for athletic movement patterns. So essentially the main goal is to increase muscular size or cross-sectional area. So that comes at a cost on structural integrity or joint integrity. So generally to execute really classic bodybuilding movements, you're putting your joints at a greater stress they need to, which is not necessarily an ideal thing for athletic development. It also doesn't address motor development in athletic sequencing, which is a really important thing we want to consider, not necessarily to a specificity point of view, but from a motor planning development. Generally undeveloped structural strength, which I was talking about earlier, relative to the muscular development. So what I mean by that is that it's really good for developing muscular development, but it usually goes above and beyond what the joints can handle. And so it puts us in an exposure for joint laxity or risk of joint injury in sports. The third one is weightlifting. Weightlifting is a really effective way to develop strength and power qualities simultaneously. So we can start to develop increased relative strength whilst also converting that to power qualities at the same time. It does require a high motor efficiency to complete. So it does have a high sort of training age requirement. It incorporates elements of powerlifting and bodybuilding within it. So when you're looking at weightlifting programs traditionally, they're going to have some high rep work in there. They're going to have some isolation work to target certain muscle areas that allow them to execute their 2 techniques properly. It doesn't, however, address all structural elements of the body efficiently. So when you're looking at the snatch and clean and jerk, they're very squat-based movements. So our posterior chain hinge development is really hindered by that. And it has a high form of specificity to just those 2 movements I mentioned. So again, going back to sort of the powerlifting bodybuilding, your bandwidth for training exposure is greatly reduced. Now, as tools and methods, they all have their place, and combining elements of all 3 will really help develop good training programs. And that's what we want to look at with an athletic training model, is that we're taking the best of these training methods and then we're applying it in a setting that suits our goals the best. I'm going to just go over some of the specific methods now, give you a quick rundown, and we'll practice some of these on Friday. So a few of these are some of the ones we use, and then some of the common ones that you'll see. So there's the 1x20 method, which Dr. Yes has created, which is getting a little bit more popularization now. A really good foundational program, which basically looks at 14 to 20 exercises, performing one set of 20 reps to failure. If you get over 20 reps, you go up in weight next session. If you get under 15 reps, you'll go down a weight. It has a very low training stress. So in terms of recovery, you can have a high frequency. It allows you to train a lot of different movements at the same session. So it's a really effective way in that initial training exposure to develop intermuscular coordination with athletes. And then once you can progress the weights to a heavy enough load, you can start to get some really good morphological stress too. So it's a really good training program for someone in that general preparatory phase. That can also be used in different rehabilitation systems. From there, you've got your linear step and linear intensifications. So a linear step would be something where you're increasing the volume. So it might be like a 3, 8, 10, 12 approach. So 3 sets by 8 reps, 10 reps, 12 reps over 3 different weeks, where you're increasing their ability to complete the task on higher reps. You might do it within a set too. So you might be first set's 8 reps, second set's 10 reps, third rep's 12 reps, and you're trying to challenge that system. Linear intensification is quite the opposite. You might be dropping the reps or increasing the weight. So you're trying to increase the intensity linearly, and that's progressive over weeks or sessions or sets. Thomas DeLorme's 3x10, which is probably the most famous. Not many people know the origin of it. It was actually a rehab tool used in the wartime, which was basically looking at trying to increase someone's asymmetrical leg strength back to the original strength of its other leg. So that's essentially where that came from, and it's sort of something that's just stuck. It's sort of a really effective way to coach and implement, and a really basic way to get someone moving with some sort of intensity from the start. APRE or APRA is an auto-progressive resistance exercise training system, which basically looks at training as hard as you can based off repetition maxes. So there is 10-6-3 approaches. So essentially what you do is you establish your 10 RM and you perform 2 build-up sets, and then you'll perform 2 working sets at that 10 RM. If you exceed it by 2 reps, you'll go up. If you do not succeed if you do not get within 2 reps, you'll go down in weight, and you'll perform 2 working sets at that weight. So essentially you're training at your relative max, but at sub-maximal intensities. As you move into 6s and 3s, that will slightly change a little bit. That's a really effective method for getting people strong quickly, and it works really well to help people understand what they're actually capable of, especially from sort of getting in the 3x10 trap a little bit. Further to that, you have your RPE range sets. So that's giving someone a rep range, might be 10 to 12. Similar to the APRE, but a little bit more controlled in terms of training intensity, is that if you exceed 12 reps, that's your sign to go up in weight. And if you don't exceed 10 reps, you'll be going down in weight. Texas 5x5, a really common American approach for strength endurance. So building a strength capacity before going into more of a powerlifting scheme. And that can be done with multiple movements across multiple days. So from there, you'd probably go into something like a Jim Wendler 5-3-1, which is an intensive powerlifting program, and probably one of the most common or simply understood ones. You've also got things like your West Side conjugate programs, which is changing weekly exercises and rep ranges to constantly change the stimulus on the body. Slightly more advanced methods, and not stuff that we use a heck of a lot, but still stuff to be aware of that's out there. Then you've got some of your more cluster forms of training which can slide into the same sessions. You've got your drop sets where you're picking a weight and generally going to burnout, dropping the weight and continuing going. So your goal is to get as much metabolic stress on the body, or looking at morphological adaptations. We have our cluster sets, which has sort of been called the HIIT of strength training. It can be a really effective way to get over plateaus or using strength-based numbers on repeat. So doing 3 reps, 10-second rest, 3 reps, 10-second rest, 3 reps, and then having 2 to 3 minute rest at potentially a 5 RM. So you've now hit 9 reps of your 5 RM weight in the same time, or a slightly extended amount of time. Can be a really effective way to increase your total volume at high intensities. Escalating density or EDT training is a really great tool for short-timed sessions, so trying to get as much work in as possible. How this works is that you'll generally pick a weight sub-maximally, so you might pick a 10 RM weight, pick 2 exercises, and do 5 reps for an 8-minute block. And what you're doing is you might do pull-ups and bench press, and you'll do 5 reps of pull-ups and 5 reps of bench press, and you'll go backwards and forwards with 0 rest. To the point, if you start fatiguing, you'll drop to 4 reps, 3 reps, 2 reps, and then potentially even 1 rep. And the goal there is to be doing as much work as possible for the 8 minutes. At the end of the 8 minutes, you work out how much volume you've achieved, and then you can measure that volume week to week. You can use time sets, so changing the reps to time. Again, another morphological approach or a bodybuilding approach where you're focusing on exposing the muscle to a certain time under tension. And then there's also complexes, so pairing exercises together using barbells or dumbbells for the same piece of equipment and going into different movements without rest. That can be a really great way to build capacity and that structural strength, or ticking off multiple things in the same session. It's important to note that not all these methods, or these aren't all the methods. There are millions of methods out there, and your methods that you use are only limited by the creativity that you can demonstrate and the environment, the access that you have with your athletes. Again, so the main ones highlighted is sort of the 1 to 20 to APRE are sort of common things we use, and then drop sets, cluster sets, escalating density, time sets, and we'll have a play around with this on Friday as well. Finally, last step, guys, our system. Really simple. These are the steps that we look to take place in developing our strength programs and what we need to address. The first thing we need to do is we need to profile the athlete. We need to work out their strengths and weaknesses. We need to identify their deficiencies and where we need to improve them. So essentially what we need to do is we need to profile them to work out where are they at and where they need to get to improve their sports performance. From that, we need to identify where their level of strength training exposure is already at to understand what adaptations they need. Do they need basic intermuscular coordination improvements? So am I focusing on skill-based? Am I focusing on morphological stress by increasing their muscular tissue? Or am I ready to push them to that more neurological stress side of things? We need to address the most notable deficiency first. So once we've profiled the athlete, identified the areas of weakness, this is what we're doing. We're finding our biggest rock and targeting that first. Once we've targeted the weakness areas and we're starting to get them in a progressive manner to where we want them, it's about building long-term sustainability and robustness in the athlete. And so our approach there is to then basically not maintain, but develop all qualities progressively over time. How do we do that? Simple. So we want to start simple to complex, slow to fast, static to dynamic, bilateral to unilateral, general to specific, closed to open, and low intensity to high intensity. So whenever we're making an exercise progression or a challenge or a change to their program, we are working within the bandwidths of these variable factors. We are starting simple, we are building to complex. We need to be achievable for them, and then we need to challenge that ability to execute that. The simpler the training, the better results. The more you confuse it or the more you try to do too much, you're going to take away from the benefit of the adaptation or the dosage of the adaptation. So we really take a simple strength approach based off these variable factors and ensure that what we are doing is achievable along these parameters. As a follow-up to these guys, if you want a little bit more information, check out the Strength Coach Playbook by Joe Ken and Every Day is Game Day by Mark Verstagen. Probably two of the really simple ways to understand how we can apply strength training methods in athletic populations. Joe Ken uses more of a powerlifting approach, but puts it in a really cool way for athletes to train. And Every Day is Game Day is a really holistic approach to sports performance. If you're looking for more of the scientific approach, then the Science and Practice of Strength Training by Zach Sarowski is probably one of the better resources. And then if you want some more practical resources, jump on danbakerstrength.com, Australian strength and conditioning coach with really simple, easy to understand, practical strength knowledge. And finally, guys, just a list of references. So that's it for today. Take it in, think of some questions. Hopefully it makes sense. As I said, don't get too caught up in the science side of stuff. Just understand it's there. have the thought process to understand when you're training someone, where your exercise selection fits in, where your dosages fits in, and make sure we have that context around where we're going with our training. Hopefully that helps, guys. I look forward to catching up with you on Friday and going through the practical side of things and answering any questions you might have on the topic.